Why do people use plant cabinets?
What kind of plants do well in there?
Is it expensive?
Which plants hate it?
Where do I start?
These are the most common questions I get asked about growing plants in a cabinet environment.
What are the pros and what are the cons?
So today I thought I would break it down and attempt to simplify cabinet growing so that you can get a better understanding of it and learn how to use it effectively and cheaply to keep your own plants happy. But first, if you're new here, hi, my name's Claire and this is Yoli. I make videos all about houseplant care, sharing tips and tricks I've learnt over the years to help keep your plants happy and healthy. And there's a lot of things that I wish I'd known about sooner when it comes to cabinet growing, from setting up a cabinet to getting the best out of your plants in a cabinet environment. So yeah, I hope you find this useful and I hope you enjoy it. Let's get into it. So firstly, let's start with the obvious question. Why do people grow plants in cabinets? What difference does it actually make?
In a nutshell, a cabinet is simply an indoor greenhouse. It's the same as a grow tent. Yes, it might look pretty, but essentially that's all it is. It creates a little microclimate for the plants inside, which you, the grower, can control, compared to controlling the elements in your entire living room, for example. Putting it simply, you could hypothetically choose to grow your plants in a baking hot, humid space without having a baking hot, humid home. Because it's a small contained space, you're able to manipulate the conditions in the exact way you want them in order to replicate the natural growing conditions of certain plants, therefore keeping them happier and growing well. A cabinet space also provides a physical barrier, meaning that if you've got a bouncy dog with a waggy tail, for example, or small children that are prone to grabbing things, your plants can be protected.
When we talk about controlling growing conditions, the main factors we tend to focus on are humidity, temperature and light. And as a general rule of thumb for a lot of tropical houseplants, increasing all of these things is a really good way to help them to grow faster and size up quicker. For example, this one here is a Drimonia chiribagana, and this one's native to the rainforests of Ecuador, so obviously it enjoys very humid conditions as well as lots of light and lots of warmth. So cabinet life is very well suited to this plant. And if I was to grow it outside of a cabinet environment, like in the middle of this room here, for example, chances are it might still survive, but it definitely wouldn't be thriving in the same way as it would be in this environment here. And oh my goodness, this one is loving it in the cabinet. I only got this at the beginning of the year, and this is all new growth in the last month and a half, which is just crazy. But this doesn't mean that I can't ever transition this plant out of the cabinet at some point. For example, if it starts to outgrow the cabinet and I want to grow it somewhere else in my home. But notice how I just said transition instead of move. Remember that, because I will come back to that in a moment. So what do you need in order to get set up and started? Well, the first is pretty obvious. You need a cabinet itself. And cabinets come in all shapes and sizes. None of the ones in my collection were actually made for growing plants in. They're all just standard glass display cabinets, and I have converted them into little planty grow zones. I thought I would just have a quick look on eBay and Facebook Marketplace, and I can see actually quite a few listed here that start at under £10, so I would definitely recommend doing a little bit of local digging in your area. Also, the one that I've got through in the bedroom, I found on eBay a couple of years ago, I think for under £20, which is, in my opinion, a really good price for a really decent sized cabinet. Lots of the ones that I can see coming up here are ones like this, which as you can see is made of wood and glass. And although it's absolutely fine to use that, I would just be a little bit wary when you're using wood if it's untreated wood. In fact, I would probably treat it with some sort of waterproof coating, just because if it's in a very humid environment over a long period of time, it's probably going to rot if you don't do that.
If you can't find anything you like within your price range, I've also seen people create their own mini cabinet environments by using things like plastic sheeting and sealing it at the edges. After all, a cabinet is simply a contained space. I've never tried doing this myself, but it's an option worth bearing in mind.
The next thing to think about is light, and because you're creating an artificial growing environment, artificial light is also going to be needed, and this is where grow lights come in. Grow lights are great because you can not only control the intensity of the light that your plants are receiving, but also how many hours each day they receive, and this is something that people just don't think about enough. Some tropical plants would ideally be receiving up to 16 hours of light a day. So even if you're keeping them right in your south-facing window and they're getting lots of sun from morning till evening, chances are this still might not be enough for them. With some types of plants, the Hoya wilbergraves for example, I've noticed that the hours of light it receives are actually a lot of the time more important than the intensity. And this one was growing so ridiculously slowly for me for such a long time. Also, if you look at the size of the growth it was giving me, you can see it is significantly smaller than what it's giving me now. And I just kind of thought that maybe that's just how the plant was and that there was nothing I could do about it. But when I increased the hours of light that this plant was receiving, that's when I really started to notice it kick into action, and it started giving me beautiful growth, despite the fact that the actual intensity of the light it was receiving hadn't changed at all. Here in the UK, we actually spend most of the year with much lower lighting conditions than our tropical plants actually need. So even if they are surviving in our care, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're thriving in the same way as they would be if we were to increase their light.
There's so many grow lights available nowadays, it can be really hard to know where to get started. In my little countertop cabinet here, I've just rested some cheap grow lights I found on Amazon on top, and the light they provide seems to be keeping these plants pretty happy. The only con with using these lights is that I found they often don't last very long, so I've had to replace them quite a few times over the years. The grow lights I use here in my bigger cabinets are by a company called Mother, and although they're a bit pricier, they're super reliable and will literally last you forever. I've definitely spent more money over the years replacing bad quality grow lights than I have on actually investing in decent ones like this, but I know the upfront cost can sometimes put people off.
If you need help justifying it, money aside, just think about the time and energy you put into your plants. Do you see this as a short-term hobby or a long-term obsession? Once you've got your grow lights, just be aware that even if they don't emit a huge amount of heat, your plants may still be able to burn if they get too close. And this one here, back in the day when it could actually fit in my cabinet, because as you can see, she's very, very big now, but this one's leaves just grew towards the light and I didn't notice it for a couple of days, and she scorched really, really badly. And I ended up having to chop back about 4 or 5 of her leaves, which was heartbreaking. So yeah, just make sure you're keeping a very close eye on your plants and not letting them get too close, particularly if there are delicate foliagey plants like this one.
This is how I've currently got my plants positioned in comparison to the grow lights, and it's working really well for me. But if you're in any doubt, start by placing them slightly further away and gradually moving them closer.
Some people also choose to use fans in their cabinet setups, and to be honest, that's not something that I really bother with nowadays. But if you look back at my older videos on YouTube, you will see that I used to do that a lot. And the reason people recommend doing this is just because whenever you've got a contained space without good airflow, your plants and soil both become much more susceptible to things like mold and mildew, which are both things that you don't want to be dealing with. The reason that I don't use fans nowadays in any of my cabinets is that personally for me, it just seems to be a little bit of a waste of money. I know for some people it is necessary, but one of my fans broke in my bedroom cabinet and I didn't get around to replacing it for about 6 weeks. And over that period of time, I was like, okay, I'm just going to see what happens in here. I'm going to see what changes. And for me, absolutely nothing changed. And I think the reason for that being is just because I do regularly open and close my cabinet doors. And I think for my cabinet spaces, that is enough airflow. If you're not opening your cabinets for weeks on end, then perhaps a fan, in fact, a fan definitely would be useful. But in my case, it just wasn't worth it. So yeah, I personally do not do it nowadays, and I haven't had any issues because of it.
And to be honest, I've got to say the same thing about humidifiers. I used to run little humidifiers in my cabinets, but honestly nowadays I don't think it's necessary. As plants transpire, they naturally produce humidity, so when they're crammed together in a sealed environment, they essentially act as a humidifier for each other. So that, along with lots of damp moss and damp soil, tends to keep the humidity levels pretty high.
It's up to you how high you want to keep the humidity in your cabinet, but for me, I try to make sure that my one there stays over 70% humidity at all times. Sometimes it will go to 80 or even 90% humidity, which is amazing, but if I do notice it start to drop below 70%, typically what I'll do is I'll just fill little cups or bowls with water and I'll put them in there so that as they evaporate, they'll naturally raise the humidity levels without the cost of running a humidifier. So those are the basics, and one thing thing that I should have absolutely said as well is that if your cabinet has any gaps around it, I would highly recommend sealing those. I personally just use a shower seal or something like that to just run around the edges, just to help the space remain even more contained. If you want to make things a little fancier with your cabinet setup, you can start thinking about things like backing boards and shelves for your cabinet, like I've done with this one here, which is really great because it allows you to just optimize the space, fit loads and loads of plants in there, and also play about with each plant's proximity to the grow lights. If you live in a very cold environment as well and you want to raise the overall temperature in your cabinet, you could also think about adding in a heat mat.
I'll link everything I've used for my cabinet here down below, although there's really no rules on how you set yours up. At one point I was using transparent pots turned upside down as little pedestal shelves for plants. The one thing I will say is be careful if you're using anything made out of wood or chipboard in your cabinet, as over time it can start to rot if you don't treat it first.
And I've spoken a little bit about plants that like life in a cabinet, but how do you really know? How can you tell which plants are going to love it and which are going to hate it? The best place to start, of course, is by researching your plant and looking at where it's native to, looking at what its natural growing conditions would be. And assuming you've set up a cabinet space similar to what I have, so this is a tropical cabinet. My plants in here receive about 15 hours of light a day. I try to keep the temperature around 24 degrees Celsius and the humidity never drops below about 70%. Assuming you've created a cabinet similar to mine, then you'll be able to immediately say that, okay, most tropical rainforest plants are gonna love life in here. And yes, I know I do have a lot of tropical plants outside my cabinet as well. So when I'm trying to decide which ones go into the cabinet and which ones don't, I tend to go with the ones that I find the most difficult to grow, ones that might have given me grief, ones that just might not be getting on particularly well in normal room conditions. Those are usually the ones that I pick to go into the cabinets because it just tends to make my life a little bit easier. Some tropical plants are just hardier than others. For example, the Philodendron Jose Bueno here would probably love life in a cabinet. In fact, I know it would love life in the cabinet, but it's never given me any reason to believe that it needs to be in a cabinet environment because it's giving me lovely growth in standard room conditions. However, for example, the variegated Rhaphidophora tetrasperma, this one was growing outside of a cabinet for the first few months of me owning it, and it didn't give me any growth at all. It was doing okay, it was surviving, but it just wasn't doing anything. And I put it into the cabinet, and within the space of a week, I was noticing it was starting to give me growth. So some plants do just need cabinet life. I've also noticed there's been quite a few velvet leafed types of plants that don't enjoy life in the cabinet, and this doesn't apply to all velvet leaf plants, but for example my Alocasia Mitchellitziana, my variegated Alocasia Frydek, certain types of velvet leaf anthuriums as well have just seemed to hate it in the cabinet and have done much better in standard room conditions.
I wish there was just a simple, straightforward answer to this question, but honestly, besides thoroughly researching your plant's natural growing conditions and using this as a guide, it does simply come down to trial and error. I've known some people grow a certain type of plant wonderfully in a cabinet, and for me, it hasn't responded well at all, and vice versa.
And on the note of changing your plant's environment, remember what I said earlier in the video about transitioning your plants out of the cabinet instead of just moving them? And this is where acclimation comes in. And I think the word transitioning and acclimation kind of go hand in hand, because acclimation is basically just the process of adjustment that your plant goes through in order to be happy and healthy in its new environment when it's come from another one. So instead of just a sudden move, we want to make this a gentle and easy transition so that your plant doesn't go into shock. Going back to my big Alocasia Jacqueline that I showed you earlier, as I say, this one did get so big in the cabinet that I had to take it out and acclimate it to normal room conditions. And there's a few different ways that you can do it, but how I did it with this plant, because obviously this was a ginormous plant, I put it right by my humidifier, so it was getting very similar humidity levels to what it was used to in the cabinet. I had it in a south-facing window, so again, its lighting was very similar. And just for the first couple of weeks, I really made an effort to keep this room around the same temperature as it was receiving in the cabinet. And then gradually, as conditions started to change back to my normal, this plant just adjusted with it. But if you're talking about a smaller plant, if you've got a plant, for example, this size that you want to take out of the cabinet, what I typically do is I'll either just take it out of the cabinet for like an hour a day for the first couple of days and then put it back in. With this plant, it was so big that it needed to come out of the cabinet immediately, so that wasn't an option. But yeah, I will just make it a gradual transition, take it in, take it out, and then start leaving it out for longer and longer and longer until it's acclimated. And the other thing that you can do as well is just put a clear plastic bag over the plants, because that just helps to keep it kind of replicates cabinet conditions. It helps to keep the humidity levels really high and means that then again you can just take the bag off for an hour or two and just do the transition in that way. Something that can be both a pro and a con of cabinet growing is dealing with things such as pests. And obviously, if you were to get pests in the rest of your collection and your cabinet plants are sealed away, then fantastic, they're all safe and secure. It's not going to spread as easily. However, if you get pests in your cabinet, oh my goodness, it's something you need to deal with very quickly because they spread like wildfire. And also because typically a cabinet environment is a lot warmer, that can just increase the rate at which certain pests multiply. So it's just really important to stay super, super on top of your pest checking. And if you see anything that you suspect might be pest related, taking that plant out of the cabinet and isolating it straight away. Putting preventative measures in place, such as using biological pest control, aka predatory mites, in a cabinet environment, is honestly what I would recommend. I use it in all of my cabinet spaces and it just makes life so much easier. I've made videos as well before about predatory mites because I know a lot of people have lots of questions around them and lots of common misconceptions, so I will link those videos down in the description box below. It's possible to create really effective designated zones for your plants by using cabinets as well. And I know I said that the cabinet that I've got through in my bedroom currently isn't in the best way. Previously, I have been using it for rehab, like rehabilitation plants that need a little bit more attention, a little bit more TLC. It just is really useful for me to be able to know that they're in a space that is controlled. I can monitor their environment and I can keep a closer eye on them in a way that I probably wouldn't be able to do if they were just in with the rest of my collection.
Another massive benefit of tropical cabinet growing is that I found it creates the perfect environment for many plants to propagate in. Again, because you're able to control the conditions and raise things such as heat, light and humidity, lots of my plants root faster and have a much higher success rate than if I were to propagate them outside of a cabinet.
Personally, I've just found that growing a lot of my plants in this way has not only made my life a hell of a lot easier, but it's also just really allowed me to bring out the best potential in a lot of my plants and just achieve some really amazing growth that I probably wouldn't have been able to achieve without having a cabinet. And yeah, I was going to say as well, I've also made step-by-step setup videos of exactly how I set my cabinets up, so I will link those down below in the description box. But I really hope you found this video useful and I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, please make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, have a lovely day, and I will see you in the next video.
Stay sexy, plant lovers.